racist police officer believes a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him for no apparent reason later on. He discovers he has just arrested an FBI agent, Marcus Davis, who turned a page in the book he was reading under a warm glow created by the late afternoon sun. Lush greenery. One of his favorite places, a little refuge in a busy city where he could clear his mind and escape the demands of his job today. His thoughts were interrupted across the park. Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing the park area. His keen eyes scanned the surroundings. He had walked this beat for over 2 decades. In his mind, he knew this city better than anyone. When he noticed Marcus seated alone on the bench, something in his gut stirred a feeling he had learned to trust over the years. He stopped walking and watched Marcus for a moment, trying to place the feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus, a vague, flimsy lead, but it was enough for Brian. Too composed, suspicion prickled at the margins of his thoughts. Never seen him around here before, Brian muttered under his breath. Marcus could see Brian standing a distance away, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. He felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up from his book, prejudice masquerading as concern. A suspicion that Marcus had been in situations like before could clearly show. Marcus closed his book, carefully marking the page with a finger, and met Brian's stare. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. He noticed the way Marcus gazed at him, steady, unaffired. It unsettled him. Let's see what foundation Marcus had other than the color of his skin. Marcus watched Brian approach, keeping his posture stiffened with each step he didn't like. He knew what was coming and had seen it many times before. The calmness, the lack of fear, it was unsettling. Marcus looked at him. Brian muttered. Brian said as he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it Marcus could hear. He knew that how he responded in the next few minutes would decide how it turned out. He wasn't in the mood for this today, but he also wouldn't provide the officer any justification for escalating the matter after noon. Underlying mistrust. Afternoon. Marcus answered, his voice calm, and even he kept his hands visible, resting on the closed book in his lap. What brings you out here today? Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book. He was fishing for something, anything, to justify the feeling gnawed. Marcus said, it's a great day. Brian nodded slowly, though he wasn't really listening. He was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying and what he could dig out from under the surface. You from around here? Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. I have been around. Brian knew his rights, knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew that refusing could quickly escalate the situation. Non-answer didn't sit well with him. He changed his weight. His stance became more confrontational. Marcus asked, his tone measured. He met Brian's gaze without flinching. Brian bristled at the question. There was that calmness again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. You will be if you don't. Cooperate. Brian shot back his hand, moving to rest on his holster. Marcus took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't like where this was heading, but he was not going to back down. I am just sitting in a park, said his voice steady. Is there a law against that? Brian's patience was wearing thin. Marcus asked softly, Brian's jaw. Someone we were searching for, stated, though even he realized how weak the reason sounded. He went closer, hovering over Marcus, but retained Brian's stare, refusing to give him the response he was hoping for. What description is that? Marcus said gently. Marcus knew he could push back and could assert his. He was not about to let that happen. So he snapped, show me some ID now for a moment. The two men locked eyes. The tension thickening between them, Marcus knew, could be avoided by admitting that. Rights. But he also knew that doing so could make this situation much more dangerous. He decided to comply for now without a word. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Brian watched every movement closely. His body coiled like a spring and grabbed it from his hand. Marcus sighed inwardly, but did as he was told, rising slowly. From the bench he kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Brian any reason to claim he felt threatened. Turn around. The name meant nothing to him, but that didn't matter. Marcus felt a surge of frustration when Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. He pushed it down, turned around, could hear people nearby staring at him, but he stayed calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do right now was give him anger. As Brian tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. He was making a mistake, but his pride would not let him stop. Now he grabbed Marcus's arm and started guiding him towards the patrol car parked nearby. Marcus did not say a word, as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He was not worried about himself. He knew that this officer would find out soon enough, but he couldn't help but feel a great weariness, a tiredness that went beyond this one encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that despite all his accomplishments, all his efforts were still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people. Officer Brian Harkins watched the car pull away from the park, observing the trees blur past, wondering how this day would turn out. Brian opened the rear door and guided Marcus inside, the tension still hanging in the air, cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. Like many others had gone so wrong, the patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Brian Harkin drove Marcus Davis toward the precinct. Brian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like the way Marcus had looked at him back there in the park, calm, unafraid, like he knew something. Brian did it. Gwetted him, made him doubt his instincts, but his pride wouldn't let him admit that Marcus sat silently in the rear seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind was focused on what would happen next. The system knew how quickly things could pass. Brian asked, his voice edged with suspicion, "What were you really doing in that park?" He knew his own power, the authority that came with his position, but he also knew he had to be careful. Officer Harkin had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Brian glanced at. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A man like you just sitting there reading. You want me to believe?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. His face was inscrutable. "I told you," he said calmly. "I was just reading." Brian slip in his words, but instead of backing down, you doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," Marcus said, trying to justify his actions. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. Finally speak his voice. "What does?" Someone like Brian answered. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded, but he wasn't about to tell Marcus or himself. Instead, he concentrated on driving, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to disturb him. The car pulled into Bryant Park near. Brian's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This was not how arrests were supposed to go. Marcus was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed in walking toward the building. He got out first, then opened the back door and helped Marcus out, the cuff still digging into Marcus's wrists. Brian LED. Marcus ignored the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself just yet. He didn't want to explain himself until he was sure of his next move. He, with every word inside the precinct. The usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringed, the hum of conversation. Brian LED Marcus through the main hall, ignoring. Booking area, and Brian signaled for Marcus to be by the processing desk. A young man named Officer Jenkins looked up, startled to see Brian bringing someone in. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked. His eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to Brian. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, his tone clipped. Marcus handed over his ID, still reluctant to confess that he had no clear justification for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus. There was a flutter of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, nodding as he started typing into the computer. Marcus noticed the brief hesitation, filing it away in his mind. "You'll need to take him to her." Brian stiffened slightly. Captain Laura Bennett was known for being tough, but fair a stickler for procedure. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon. The recognition was subtle, but someone in her office knew who he was, Jenkins said as he handed the ID back to Brian. Marcus walked beside Brian, his expression still unreadable as they approached Captain Bennett's office. He could sense the tension in Brian. The uncertainty the officer was trying so hard to hide was the first crack. Brian's voice was tight. He turned to Marcus. His grip firm on Marcus's arm. "Let us go." Marcus observed in the armor with quiet satisfaction. Brian knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Bennett's voice from inside the office. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s, looked up with neat, organized with a large desk in the middle and shelves lined with books and files and a non-nonsense demeanor. From her paperwork, as they entered Officer Harkin, she said, her tone neutral. "What's this about?" Brian stepped forward, guiding Marcus into the room. "Caught this guy in the park." "Captain, he was acting suspiciously, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second there was a flutter of recognition. "Just?" She said, her voice even met her eyes, and saw the recognition there he knew Captain Bennett was aware of, but she was playing it gently, waiting to see how Brian would handle the situation. "That's right." Brian continued, oblivious to the silence. Like Jenkins, but she quickly masked her expression, turning professional. Marcus brought Bennett in for interrogation. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. And did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Brian hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him start to shift. "Captain," he repeated, though it sounded weaker. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair, examining Brian closely. "Officer Harkin, why don't you step outside for a moment? I would want to speak with Mr. Davis alone." Brian blinked, surprised by the request, but Captain Outside Harkin said firmly. Leaving no room for argument, Brian released Marcus and stepped out of the office. Closing the door behind him, Captain Bennett's behavior changed slightly to become less formal. Mr. Davis said, her voice calm. "I apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus allowed yourself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You are just doing your job." Bennett sighed, glancing at the closed door. "I am aware of who you are." Marcus nodded, of course, but if we kept that under wraps for now, I need to handle this carefully. "Captain, I just want to make sure things are handled properly," Bennett assured him. "I will speak with Officer Harkin and deal with this appropriately, but I have to ask why." Captain Bennett considered his words, then nodded in understanding. "You're right. It shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect." Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Should not matter." Marcus nodded once more. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he had the upper hand now. The truth would come out soon enough. Room fell silent for a moment. Captain Bennett stood up. "I'll call Officer Harkin back in. We'll resolve this." Captain Bennett opened the door. Brian stepped back inside, his expression wary. He could sense that something had changed, but he didn't know what he glanced at. Marcus, who stood calmly waiting. "Mr. Davis is not the man you were looking for. You will release him immediately." Officer Harkin would have to face the consequences of his activities. Blinked the words, taking a moment to sink in. "What but Captain?" he immediately. Officer Bennett repeated her voice, leaving no room for argument. Brian hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Marcus's handcuffs. His hand shook slightly as he did so, realizing his mistake beginning. "You're free to go. You're free to go." Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. "I'll be in." To dawn on him as the cuffs clicked open, Marcus rubbed his wrists, giving Brian a measured look. "Thank you, officer." Brian swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "I look forward it, Mr. Davis." Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Brian standing there, sinking feeling in his gut. The confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. "Brian." "Touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There is still a lot to discuss." Heron had barely been able to focus since Captain Bennett had released Marcus Davis. The unease noted him, deepened by the fact that he still didn't understand what had just happened. He knew he had made a mistake, but the whole extent of it was still out of reach. The tension in his body refused to dissipate. His eye looked up to see Captain Bennett walking toward him, her expression serious. Brian's stomach tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral suddenly. "Be a casual conversation, officer. Harkin's my office now." Captain Bennett set her tone, leaving no room for argument. Brian stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that was beginning to creep into his demeanor. He followed her to the office each step, feeling heavy. Then the last, once inside, Captain. Bennett closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Brian hesitated for a moment, then sat down. She could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. Captain Bennett moved behind her desk, her sharp eyes fixed on his officer Harkin. She began her tone, measured but stern. "Do you have any idea who Marcus Davis is?" Brian shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain, just some guy in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Brian's. "Marcus Davis isn't just some guy in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Brian's. "Marcus Davis." Bennett's voice firm, and more than that. "His arrest will have major consequences, not just for you, but also for this entire precinct." Brian's mind widened in shock. The implications of what he had done crashed down on him. An FBI agent repeated his voice barely above a whisper, trying to put together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent no less, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know." Captain Brian said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was. That's the problem." Harkins. Bennett said, her tone still strong. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on presumptions and biases, not on any actual proof. You cannot arrest someone simply because they do not appear like they belong in a park." Brian wanted to defend. Brian asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident." The words wouldn't come deep down. He knew Captain Bennett was right. Had let his prejudices guide his actions now. Brian's heart sank. Termination, the word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of this already spoken with the higher-ups. They are not happy, to say the least. Brian's heart sank. Bennett eyed him for a time, her face softening somewhat. "I know, Captain." Brian eventually muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Losing his V was almost too much to take, as much as he tried to deny it. Brian nodded. Though his mind was still whirling, the reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of consequences. Not just for you, but for the people you serve. Harkin finds this difficult to hear. Regret. He had always prided myself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community, but now all of that was in jeopardy because of one negligent, prejudiced decision. Captain Bennett stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "You're dismissed, Officer Harkin. I'll notify you when the..." Brian stood up as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled before turning and leaving the precinct. Familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear, there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of doubt. For the first time, Brian was forced to. Brian could not get rid of the image of Marcus Davis's calm, unflinching gaze. Maybe he was not the upstanding officer he had always believed himself to be, that maybe he had let his prejudices guide his actions more than he was willing to admit as he drove home, the city streets passing by in a blur. Look, that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why Marcus had seen right through him, had exactly what was happening even before Brian finally arrived home. He sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, the day events played over, and each repetition making exactly what was happening. Brian got out of the car and walked into his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressing in on him sank him into a chair. His thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret. The weight of his actions heavier, he knew what the future held. And uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, he had no idea what to do next. Brian Harkins stood in the quarter outside the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. The precinct was quieter than usual, the atmosphere heavy with the expectation of what was about to unfold. The official review was about to begin, and Brian knew every word. He said in the next hour. Glancing at his reflection in the window across from him, the man staring back looked older, more worn than he had just days ago. There was a stiffness in his posture, a tightness of around his eyes that hadn't been there before he straightened his. Though deep down, he wasn't sure how to explain. This was his chance to explain, to justify his actions. The door to the conference room opened and Captain Bennett appeared, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Harkins." Her voice steady. Brian agreed, swallowing hard as he followed her into the room amid the tense atmosphere. The long table was surrounded with stern-faced officials, members from the PRIST's Internal Affairs section. A handful of high-ranking officers, and at the far end a guy in a suit. Brian, instantly identified as Marcus Davis. Marcus's presence was like a punch to the gut. Brian had hoped he wouldn't be there. He wouldn't have to face him again. But here he was, sitting calmly, his eyes focused on Brian, as if the look in those eyes was the same as before. Calm, unflinching, but Brian felt small. Captain Bennett took her seat at the head of the table, motioning for Brian to sit in the chair opposite him, trying to ignore the way his palms were sweating. The room was silent. Officer Harkin Bennett began, her tone formal. "This review is to find out whether your behavior during Mr. Marcus Davis's arrest is appropriate. We will review the events prior to the arrest and the results of your actions. Would you kindly understand the seriousness of this matter?" Captain Brian answered, his voice low, but steady. He looked briefly at Marcus, who was. "Let's start with the incident report according to your statement. You arrested Mr. Davis because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of robberies." Brian nodded. "Yes, Captain. I watched him in the park and he matched the description. We had tall black male, early 40s. He was acting suspiciously. So I approached him, and what exactly was suspicious about his behavior?" Bennett asked, her tone neutral but probing. Brian hesitated, knowing that his answer here was crucial. "He was alone, just sitting there, and when I asked for..." Brian explained, though even as he said the words sounded weak to his own ears. He seemed like he was hiding something. Marcus's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. His ID was evasive. Exactly the behavior of a criminal. On the run. Brian flinched slightly at Marcus's words, but kept his attention on Bennett. "I was just doing my job. Captain, I was trying to protect the community. And did you find anything on Mr. Davis that would indicate he was involved in any criminal activity?" Bennett asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Brian shook his head no. He was clean. There was a heavy silence in the room as everyone considered what had been said. Then, one of the internal affairs officers spoke up. "Stern Officer Harkins, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Davis might have been reporting the truth, that he wasn't the suspect you were?" Looking for Brian, paused once more. His mind racing for the appropriate words, "I followed protocol trained to be cautious to assume that someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been influenced by elements other than protocol?" the officer asked. "I was just doing my job." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Brian. "Your job is to protect and serve Officer Harkin, not to pointly." Brian's throat tightened. He knew what they were getting at, and he knew there was no good answer. "I did not mean to profile him. Judge people based on their appearance." Brian met Marcus's eyes, and for a moment he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, and this was one of those times. Captain Bennett cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention back to her officer. Brian felt a sinking sensation in his gut, and knew that every officer in this precinct is upholding the values of justice and fairness. "Harkins, this review is not only about what happened that day, but also about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to make sure every officer in this precinct is upholding these ideals." The realization hit him hard, and for a moment I struggled to find my voice. "I understand, Captain," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." I wanted he stopped the words choking in his throat. It was not just about whether or not he had made a mistake. Another long pause, the weight of the situation pressing down everyone in the room. Then Marcus spoke again. Captain Bennett softened slightly, although her tone remained firm. "Harkins, all make mistakes. It's how we deal with those mistakes that defines us. You need to think very carefully about the kind of officer you want to be there." Captain Bennett nodded. "Of course, Mr. Davis." Marcus stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He looked directly at Brian. His expression was serious, but not cruel. "I understand that being a police officer is a difficult job. You are under constant pressure and voice calm, but carrying a weight of authority." Brian listened hard. He knew Marcus was right, but the truth of it was difficult to swallow. Sometimes pre-pressure leads to bad decisions. We cannot let those bad decisions go unpackled. This is not only about holding Officer Harkins accountable, but also about making sure something like this does not happen again. Career believing. He was doing the right thing, but now he was faced with the reality that his actions had caused harm, that his prejudices had blinded him to the truth. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, but rather here to make sure the next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before making." Marcus sat down once more, his eyes still on Brian. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was a firmness, a resolve that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any. "This is an opportunity for change." Captain Bennett nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Davis, your words are noted." Further injustice. Captain Bennett looked at Brian, her tone softer but still authoritative. "Officer Harkins, you'll remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you take this time to consider what's been said here today. We will reconvene in a few days to discuss the next step." Brian nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing here today. Brian stayed seated, his mind racing. Had come into this review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions, but now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization was like a cold, hard truth he couldn't ignore. Down on him. "Yes," Captain said quietly. The meeting was adjourned. Escape as the last official left the room. Brian stood up slowly, his motions heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He glanced at Marcus one last time, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was no hostility in Marcus's gaze, just a quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Brian looked away. He knew he had a lot to consider, and as he left the conference room, the weight of his actions and their repercussions hung over him like a dark cloud. Captain Laura Bennett sat in her office staring at the stack of reports on her desk, each piece of paper. Unable to hold Marcus's gaze anymore, she rubbed her temples, feeling the tension in her shoulders the precinct had always prided itself on maintaining. Represented a fragment of the truth she was trying to piece together. The internal investigation into Brian Harkin's behavior was underway, and she was responsible to ensure that every detail was thoroughly examined. Standards, but this incident had shook that foundation. Whatever the outcome, Bennett knew the investigation would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Brian, but for the entire department reaching for the first report. The initial witness statements from the park. She had already read multiple times, but each rereading gave the mounting proof against Brian. The witnesses, all park goers present during the arrest, described the event with stark clarity. Their accounts were consistent. Brian had approached Marcus Davis with an assumption that he was a criminal, without hesitation, and without attempting to de-escalate. Bennett turned. The body cam footage she had seen several times, each viewing more unpleasant than the last. The footage was clear and unambiguous. Brian's voice and body language reflected the presumptions he had made from the moment he saw Marcus. Her second in command for the investigation stood in the doorway. "I have the last of the witnesses." The way he had ignored Marcus's attempts to explain the force he used during the arrest was all there laid bare for anyone to see. Her thoughts were pulled from her. "Captain, most of the witnesses are pretty clear about what they saw, and from what I can tell, the body cam footage backs," Harper said, holding up a file, "and I have scheduled Marcus Davis for later this afternoon." Bennett responded. "How is Harper's side?" Running a hand through his graying hair. "Looking?" Harper asked Bennett. "Yeah," Bennett said, leaning back in her chair. "Let's see if he's ready to talk more freely about what happened." She nodded and left the office, leaving Bennett alone with the file she flipped open and began reading she grimly. Bennett finished reading, and she felt a great sense of unease. She had known Brian for years. Brian hadn't listened as Marcus had been trying to defuse the situation. New witness statements, they matched the others. Brian had acted aggressively from the start. But as Bennett kept reviewing the evidence, he discovered a sight he had never seen before. The hours passed slowly. Harper entered, followed by Brian. "Harkin," Bennett said, keeping her voice neutral. Brian looked tired, his eyes dark with sleeplessness. He sat down. Bennett said, leaning forward slightly, "I need you to be completely honest with us, Brian. This is your chance to explain your side of the story." Brian nodded, but his expression was tight. Across from Bennett, glancing nervously at Harper, who took a seat beside him. "We are going over the events of that day again. I saw a man who fit the description of the suspect we were looking for, a high-pressure situation. I had to ask Captain Bennett what was going through your mind when you first saw Marcus Davis in the park." Brian hesitated, his eyes shifting as he sought the right words. "We were looking for a black man around his height and build. He was acting suspiciously, like he was trying to hide something Bennett could hear. Make a quick decision. And what made you so sure he was the suspect?" ECT Harper pressed. "He matched the description," Brian repeated, now more defensive now. "Marcus Davis was cooperative. He tried to explain who he was, but you didn't listen." Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was trying to throw me off by why time I was just following my training. Captain Bennett repeated her tone. "Brian, the witness statements and the body cam footage tell a different story." Brian opened his mouth to respond, but Bennett held a hand to stop him. "Look, Brian, I'm not here to argue with you. The evidence we have thus far points not in your favor. Shows that you made presumptions based on race, and that those presumptions resulted in an unfair arrest." There was a long silence as Brian handled Bennett's words. Finally, I spoke, my voice low. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Bennett sighed. "I know, Brian, but intent does not change the impact of your actions. This isn't only about you. It's about what your actions reflect and how they impact the people we meant to defend, before Brian could reply. Harper stood and opened the door, revealing Marcus Davis, who entered the room calmly. "Mr. Davis, thank you for visiting," Bennett said, standing to shake Marcus's hand. Marcus nodded, his expression neutral. Of course, Captain Bennett motioned for Marcus to take a seat, then turned back to Brian. "Brian, we are going to hear from Mr. Davis. Now I want you to listen carefully." Brian nodded, though he couldn't meet Marcus's eyes. Bennett gestured for Harper to begin. "Mr. Davis, can you describe your—" Marcus's voice was consistent. "I was at the park having my day off when Officer Harkins approached me. He was hostile from the start, demanding to see my ID and questioning me like I was already guilty of something. I tried to explain that there must have been some mistake. But Harper continued, "Did you feel that Officer Harkins' actions were influenced by your race? He cuffed me, pushed me to the ground, and treated me like a criminal." Brian flinched at Marcus's words, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table in front him. "Harper, I've dealt with this kind of thing before, but it's different when it comes from someone who's supposed to be protecting and serving Bennett." The way his shoulders slumped slightly, the way he seemed to shrink into himself, yet still, the assumptions he made before I even had a chance to speak. "I hope you could take this as an opportunity to learn to understand the impact of your actions. It's not only about what you intended." Brian said nothing. Mr. Davis Bennett said, "I appreciate your honesty." Marcus nodded, then stood to leave. "I don't hold any personal grudges, Officer Harkins. This research isn't only about determining what happened. It's about how those intentions show themselves in the real world." Marcus left the room, leaving a heavy silence. Bennett looked at Brian. "Thus we have to make sure it doesn't happen again, and for the people who serve as well as for ourselves." Nodded slowly. The weight of the evidence, the words of Marcus Davis, and the reality of his actions were all starting to sink in, but whether or not he was ready to fully confront that truth remained to be seen. "Take the rest of the day," Brian Bennett said quietly. Brian stood, his motions stiff. Bennett felt a great sense of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This investigation was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done, both inside the department and outside. For now, all she could do was continue to piece together the truth, and left the office without another word. Captain Laura Bennett sat in her office, the final report of the investigation laying closed on her desk. The conclusion was clear, and the decision had been made, but that didn't make the job ahead any easier. She glanced at the clock. Knowing Marcus Davis would be arriving soon, the conversation they were about to have felt like a turning point, not just for Brian Harkin, but for the whole department. A soft knock on the door indicated Marcus's arrival. Bennett stood and gently smoothed the front of her uniform, getting ready for the conversation. She called, the door opened, and Marcus entered, her expression calm and composed as usual. Polite nod before taking a seat across from her. "Thank you for coming." Mr. Davis Bennett started sitting down as well. "Of course," Marcus replied, his tone steady. "I assume the investigation is complete." "It is," Bennett confirmed, leaning slightly after reviewing all the evidence, the body cam footage and the interviews. "It is." Bennett paused, choosing her words carefully. "I appreciate the thoroughness of the investigation, Captain, but I have to ask, do you believe this decision will lead to real change within the department?" Bennett decided Officer Harkin would be terminated from his post. Marcus nodded slowly, taking in the information. Although Brian Harkin's actions were abhorrent, and his dismissal makes it very evident that racial profiling and the misuse of authority will not be accepted. I also know that removing one cop is insufficient to address this. Marcus's eyes stayed fixed as he said, "You're right. This is about more, addressing the underlying problems. Than one officer, it's about the department's culture and the prejudices that could affect the training leaders get, affect their choices in the field. If we neglect those fundamental causes of events like this, we'll keep." Bennett nodded appreciatively at Marcus's candor. I agree that this occurrence has highlighted the necessity of systematic change is something I am dedicated to bring about. We are currently working on updating our training courses to include more thorough instruction on racial prejudice and de-escalation strategies. We want to use likewise more thorough. Marcus started with monitoring and responsibility policies, a touch of approbation in his voice, but it's going. Taking more than simply policy adjustments is about shifting the officer's perspective to enable them to grasp the IM. Their acts have an impact on the communities they serve that cannot be attained overnight. Although Bennett acknowledged it would be a challenging process, if we are to re-establish trust, it is absolutely vital. And make sure that what occurred to you does not happen to someone else. Marcus reclined back in his chair, his demeanor intelligent. I have worked in law enforcement long enough to understand that change is difficult, particularly when it requires facing difficult facts, but I'm ready to work with you, Captain, to assist in making those adjustments. This is not only about me, it's about building a more fair and safer system for everyone. Bennett had a flash of inspiration, of respect for Marcus despite everything he had gone through. He was still ready to participate, to advocate the changes necessary were so much needed. I value Mr. Davis Bennett's honest comments. Your knowledge and expertise will be much appreciated as we go ahead. I want you to know that your voice will be. Marcus nodded. Thanks, Captain. I just want to make sure that I'm not searching for any particular treatment. This department turns into the best version of itself that the community deserves, and that is what the cops aim for. Deserve too, Bennett. You're correct, and I guarantee you we're dedicated to make it happen. The room lapsed into a quiet that was pleasant for a minute, while each of them considered the weight of the choice the talk produced. Brian Harkin's firing marked just the start of the actual work ahead in the reforms and the cultural change would be required to stop other injustices. As Marcus rose to bid Bennett Rose farewell and extended her hand. Thank you one more, Mr. Davis. Marcus shook her hand firmly. Also, Captain Leighton made. Confident this marks a turning point, rather than a fleeting response. Marcus exited the office, leaving Bennett alone. Her mind strayed to the closed investigation report on her desk one final time before focusing. The choice had been taken for the future. Now, it was her and the department's responsibility to make sure it resulted in actual and lasting change. Bennett recognized the path ahead would be tough, full with opposition and hurdles. Was ready. It was about doing what was proper, no more than one police, more than one incident. Matter how hard that may be, with fresh will, Bennett went for her phone and started making the calls. It would start the department's necessary evolution, and she would act in all her ability to create changes. Yes, it did. The morning was cloudy. As Marcus Davis ascended the precinct stairs, the air felt thick although the city itself was holding its breath to see what would happen within the tight environment. Excited about the anticipated improvements Captain Bennett had promised, they were beginning to materialize, yet there. Marcus was still on a long trip ahead when he noticed the minute changes in the surroundings, afresh. Near the door, a bulletin board with details on forthcoming seminars on racial prejudice and de-escalation strategies cops use showed. Their chats in the calmer, more serious moments of the previous several weeks reflect distinct energies across the hallways. Had left a lasting impression on everyone. Marcus walked to Captain Bennett's office, bowing gently to the officials. While some averted his eyes, others reciprocated the respectful gesture. Still adjusting to the fallout of what had transpired when he arrived to Bennett's office, he found the door slightly open. He knocked gently, then pushed it open. Bennett yelled, looking up from her desk. Marcus entered, closed. Good to see you again, Mr. Davis. The door behind Bennett rose from her chair, greeted him with a kind grin. Captain Marcus said, seated across from her, wanting to see how things were going. Bennett nodded. Her tone is stern but resolute. The new training courses are under rollout, and we are. Although there is still more to be done, tightening control guarantees responsibility. It is a beginning. Although Marcus valued her honesty change with time, it's great to know the direction you are heading. How's the department managing it? Bennett acknowledged that most of the officers are on board, but that there has been some pushback. Know that these adjustments are required. We have had some challenging talks, but I am hoping we will be. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused. Nice to hear. Continuing in the correct way is vital. Maintaining the momentum will help to ensure that these improvements transcend beyond just reaction to one event agreed upon. Stated, this is about laying a fresh basis for our operations based on justice and respect for all. One we serve as Brian Harkin entered his face. The door to the office opened once again. Exhausted eyes shadowed him. He was wearing simple clothing and had a cardboard box, obviously come to gather the rest of his possessions. Captain Bryan greeted Bennett stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Marcus Bryan. Bennett said, her tone bland. The room was quiet for a minute, and the air dense with unresolved tension. Bryan eventually looked to Marcus, his countenance austere. Mr. Davis wanted to add, I didn't intend. Marcus met his eyes coolly. It is not about what you intended, Officer Harkins. It is about things turning out like way. What you did and the effects it had intentions don't justify behavior, Bryan. Cringed by Marcus's directness, but he nodded to accept the fact, I know I simply don't know how to mend. This starts with realizing that everyone has prejudices, but it's how we handle them. Marcus mentioned equally, it counts. You have the chance to grow from this, to improve yourself, thanks to Bryan's shoulders. Slung somewhat the weight of the circumstances down on him, then turned back to Bennett, his voice little above a whisper. I assume this is it. Then Bennett nodded, her face softening. It doesn't have to be the end, Bryan. You still have the option to develop from this and improve your life. However, that is entirely up to you. Bryan stood there for a while as, if I were pondering her remarks before nodding briefly, I would consider it. He stopped, then added, good luck, Captain, and to you. Mr. Davis also turned and exited the office. Bennett closed the door softly after Bryan, and Marcus inquired after a time Bennett. He watched him depart, both deep in their thoughts and wonder whether he would be well. Sighed, reclining back in her chair. I hope so. But for now, all we can do is concentrate on the task ahead of us. Marcus nodded in agreement. There is enough of that. They sat in quiet for a few seconds, the weight of which, their discussion hanging in the air. Marcus eventually rose, reaching his hand to Bennett to say, thank you for everything. Captain, I value your will to right things. Bennett shook his hand firmly and thanks Mr. Davis. Participation has been priceless. Marcus turned and left the office, headed, we are in this together. As he strolled down the halls one final time through the station, he could feel the cops staring at him rather curiously. Some reflective, he understood that while transformation wouldn't come naturally, the events of the past were vital. Past few weeks had opened a door. It was up to all of them to stroll over as Marcus left into the cold. The route ahead would be difficult, but Morning Air took a deep breath and felt resolution settle over him. This was just the beginning. He was prepared to carry on the battle for justice and would see it through. Marcus left the station, his thoughts already shifting to the next phases of his employment, driven once again. Though there was much more to be done, he felt a glimmer of optimism. Change was approaching for the first time in a long time, and he would be there to lead it at every stage. Erased.